The 10th of June, 1944, a chateau near Caen, Normandy. The ceiling beams trembled with each distant detonation, and General der Panzertruppe, Leo Geyr von Schweppenburg, stood over his maps, pressing one finger against the acetate overlay. Red arrows marked his armoured divisions that ought by now to have been crushing the Allied bridgehead. Instead, they lay scattered across 200 kilometres of Norman farmland, hemorrhaging fuel and burning under skies that belonged entirely to the enemy. Above him, a crystal chandelier swayed, a relic of more gracious times, now strangely out of place amongst maps marked with death. He could not have known that in 17 minutes the ceiling would give way, the maps would ignite, and his war would end not with tactical brilliance, but with a piece of medieval stonework embedded in his skull. Before we continue, history isn't just dates and battles. It's men lying in the mud, questioning everything they thought they knew. It's mercy shown when hatred was expected. These are the stories worth preserving. If you agree, please subscribe. It's how we continue doing this. For 32 years, Leo von Schweppenburg had built his life upon the foundation of military precision. Born into Prussian aristocracy in 1896, he'd learnt warfare in the trenches of the Great War, where mud and blood had been constants, but outcomes had followed logical patterns: superior numbers, better positions, adequate supplies. These yielded victory. By 1944, he commanded Panzer Group West, the strategic armoured reserve designed as both shield and swords of Fortress Josipova. On paper, his force was magnificent. The 2nd Panzer Division, 21st Panzer, Panzer Lehr, and the 12th Air Panzer Division Hitlerjugend. Over 600 tanks, the finest armoured vehicles the Reich could produce, crewed by veterans who had conquered Poland, France, and half of Russia. The plan had possessed an elegant simplicity. When the Allies landed, wherever they landed, von Schweppenburg would concentrate his divisions within 48 hours and launch a coordinated counter-offensive that would drive the invaders back into the Channel. German armour had always excelled at rapid concentration and devastating ripostes. The Blitzkrieg doctrine had worked in Poland in 39 days, France in 6 weeks. The initial Russian campaign had seemed unstoppable. There seemed no reason Normandy should be different, except for the scant. Von Schweppenburg had factored in Allied numerical superiority, their industrial capacity, even the possibility of difficult terrain. What he had not, could not adequately comprehend was what absolute air supremacy meant in practical terms. The Luftwaffe's daily intelligence briefings spoke of temporary local air superiority, of unfavourable weather conditions limiting operations. These phrases were bureaucratic euphemisms for a catastrophic reality. The Luftwaffe had ceased to exist as a meaningful force over Western Europe. The 7th of June brought the first reports that fractured his carefully constructed operational picture. 2nd Panzer Division, ordered to move from Abbeville to Caen, had departed at dawn with 123 operational tanks. By nightfall, only 83 remained mobile. 40 tanks lost. Not to enemy ground forces, not to mechanical failure in the usual sense, but to what the reports clinically termed air interdiction. Von Schweppenburg read the field reports in his command post, his reading glasses reflecting the lamplight, as his eyes moved across words that seemed to belong to a different war. Multiple attacks by fighter bombers. Column halted for 3 hours whilst clearing disabled vehicles. Ammunition lorry exploded, blocking road. Estimated 15 to 20 aircraft per attack. Panzer Lehr Division's journey had been even more nightmarish. Departing from Chartres, 140 kilometers from the front, the division should have reached the invasion beaches within 24 hours. Instead, it took 5 days. The division commander, General Lieutenant Fritz Bayerlein, a veteran of North Africa who had served under Rommel himself, sent increasingly desperate situation reports. On the 8th of June, he wrote, "Between Argentan and Falaise, we were attacked by swarms of fighter bombers. Bombs carpeted the road. Our vehicles could not move forward or backward. Tigers and Panthers reduced to burning hulks. The Americans do not need to defeat us in battle. They simply destroy us on the march. The Allies had spent months before D-Day systematically destroying France's transportation infrastructure. 79 bridges across the Seine and Loire had been demolished. Rail marshalling yards at Trappes, Juvisy, Amiens, and Rennes were cratered moonscapes. Every major road junction had been photographed, mapped, and added to target lists. This meant German armoured columns could not use railways and were forced onto predictable routes that made them easy prey. Von Schweppenburg had sent staff officers forward to investigate why his divisions were arriving piecemeal and depleted. They returned with accounts that seemed almost fantastical. Oberleutnant Wilhelm Wiebig described watching from a roadside cafe as a Panther tank column was attacked by 6 Hawker Typhoon fighter bombers armed with rockets. The rockets came in salvos, Wiebig reported. Each Typhoon carried 8 projectiles. The first volley struck 3 tanks. The rockets penetrated the engine decks and the tanks exploded from within. The crews who escaped were strafed as they ran. The entire attack lasted less than 4 minutes. 16 tanks destroyed or disabled. Then the aircraft departed and silence returned. Systematic, clinical. What confounded von Schweppenburg was not merely the destruction, war had always involved losses, but the psychological impact. Tank crews, even the SS fanatics of the Hitlerjugend division, were developing what field commanders termed aircraft neurosis. Crews refused to move during daylight hours. When ordered to advance, they would travel 50 meters, then halt and scan the skies. Progress measured not in kilometers per hour, but meters per minute. The paralysis was spreading faster than any Allied advance. If you're finding this fascinating, do hit subscribe. It helps us uncover more stories like this. On the 9th of June, von Schweppenburg convened a conference at his headquarters, Château La Caine, a 17th century manor house 15 kilometers south of Caen. 23 officers attended, representing every armoured division under his command. The meeting's purpose was to plan the decisive counter-offensive that would finally concentrate German armour and crush the bridgehead. Major Karl von Luttwitz of 2nd Panzer Division presented his assessment with characteristic Prussian directness. At General, the situation demands we acknowledge reality. We cannot concentrate forces under current conditions. Every road within 100 kilometers of the front is under continuous observation. Allied spotter aircraft relay our positions to fighter bomber squadrons that arrive within 15 minutes. We are fighting an enemy we cannot see, cannot engage, and cannot escape. Von Schweppenburg had responded with the certainty of 3 decades of military education. The solution is night movement and better camouflage discipline. Divisions will advance only during darkness. All vehicles will remain under tree cover during daylight hours. This is not an insurmountable problem. It requires adaptation and discipline. But even as he spoke, he noticed the faces of the younger officers. They held the expressions of men who had stopped believing in victory and now focused solely on survival. The S officers maintained their ideological rigidity, but even they could not disguise the exhaustion in their eyes, the exhaustion of spending every daylight hour expecting death from above. The 10th of June, 1400 hours. The afternoon heat made the chateau's stone walls radiate warmth. Von Schweppenburg stood in the map room with his chief of operations, Oberst Kurt von der Waal, discussing the final details of the counter-offensive scheduled to begin in 3 days. Through the tall windows, he could see his communications lorries parked in the courtyard, their aerials extended, their generators humming steadily. Those aerials were what killed him. Or nearly did. British radio direction finding stations had been tracking German military transmissions since the invasion began. Panzer Group West headquarters, as the nerve center coordinating all armoured operations, transmitted constantly. British cryptographers had not broken the tactical codes, but they did not need to. The simple fact of transmission, the volume and frequency of radio traffic, identified La Caine as a high-value target. At 13:30 hours, RAF Bomber Command received authorization for a precision strike. 71 Mitchell and Boston medium bombers, escorted by 48 fighters, were already airborne. Von Schweppenburg heard them first as a distant droning, like summer bees magnified 1,000-fold. He walked to the window. The northern sky had darkened. Not with clouds, but with aircraft. Formations so large they created their own shadows across the landscape. He experienced a moment of cognitive dissonance. This could not be real. No force could concentrate such numbers. Surely German fighters would appear to intercept. No German fighters appeared. The first bombs fell at 1417. High explosive munitions designed to destroy buildings and concrete fortifications. The chateau's courtyard erupted as a communications lorry took a direct hit, its fuel tanks igniting in a fireball that engulfed 2 staff cars. Von Schweppenburg moved away from the window as the building shook. The chandelier fell, its crystal elements shattering across the map table like frozen tears. He remembered turning towards the doorway, intending to reach the basement shelter. Then the ceiling above him, oak beams supporting 2 meters of stone and tile, collapsed. The world became noise and darkness, and the sensation of weight pressing him down into unconsciousness. When awareness returned, it came in fragments, pain in his head, sharp and absolute, a taste of blood and dust, voices speaking German, frantic, calling for medical assistance, hands lifting rubble, daylight impossibly bright as debris was cleared from his face. Hauptmann Friedrich Steinhoff, von Schweppenburg's aide, was the first face he saw. Steinhoff's uniform was torn, his face blackened with soot. Herr General, do not move, your head is injured. Medics are coming. Von Schweppenburg tried to speak, but produced only a wet cough. Blood ran from his scalp down his face, warm and sticky. He attempted to stand, but his legs would not respond. Through the ringing in his ears, he heard explosions continuing. The bombing raid was still in progress. How many? He managed to whisper. The headquarters is destroyed, Herr General. Casualties are severe. Oberst von der Waal is dead. The communications center is gone. We have lost all contact with forward divisions. The medical team arrived. 2 Wehrmacht sanitators with a stretcher and inadequate supplies. They wrapped von Schweppenburg's head with bandages that immediately soaked through with blood. The senior medic, an Oberfeldwebel with hollow eyes, examined the general's head wound and spoke quietly to Steinhoff. Skull fracture and possible internal bleeding. He needs a surgical hospital immediately or he will die within hours. But there was no surgical hospital. The nearest German field hospital with neurosurgical capability was 40 kilometers away, and the roads were still being bombed. They carried von Schweppenburg to a partially intact wine cellar and laid him on a makeshift bed of potato sacks. The pain in his head had evolved from sharp to a deep, pulsing agony that synchronized with his heartbeat. His vision blurred, then doubled. He vomited blood. Hours passed in delirium. He dreamt of Poland in 39, of French roads in 40, of victories that now seemed to belong to someone else's life. When consciousness returned, it was night. The bombing had stopped. Steinhoff sat beside him, his face illuminated by a single candle. The counter-offensive, von Schweppenburg whispered. Steinhoff's silence answered the question. There would be no counter-offensive. Panzer Group West headquarters no longer existed. 17 officers had been killed in the bombing. The radio equipment was destroyed. The files, the maps, the carefully prepared operational orders, all reduced to ash and rubble. We are moving you at dawn, Steinhoff said. There is a field hospital near Wehr. It is a risk, but remaining here is certain death. The journey began at 5 in the morning, in the half-light that precedes sunrise. They placed von Schweppenburg in a Kubelwagen, a light military vehicle that could navigate damaged roads. 2 motorcycle escorts accompanied them, armed with machine pistols, inadequate protection against fighter bombers, but psychologically reassuring. The Normandy countryside, even devastated by war, retained its essential beauty. Hedgerows formed green walls along narrow lanes. Apple orchards stood in neat rows, their fruit beginning to ripen. But superimposed on this pastoral landscape was destruction. Bomb craters 20 meters across. Busses pushed to roadsides. Blackened tree stumps marking where fuel lorries had exploded. And everywhere the smell of smoke and decomposition. They drove slowly, stopping every 15 minutes to listen for aircraft engines. The sky remained empty, not because the Allies were absent, but because dawn was the brief interval when fighter bombers returned to base for refueling and new aircraft had not yet been deployed. At 7:30, near the village of Saint-Jean-le-Blanc, they heard the sound von Schweppenburg had learnt to fear. The high-pitched scream of aircraft engines in a dive, 2 P-47 Thunderbolts, American fighters on a morning patrol, had spotted the small convoy. The motorcycles accelerated, trying to reach tree cover. The Kübelwagen driver swerved into a farm lane. Too late. The first burst of machine gun fire stitched across the road, 50 caliber bullets, throwing up geysers of dirt and stone. The Kübelwagen's windscreen exploded. The driver's head snapped forward, and the vehicle veered into a ditch, striking a stone wall with force enough to buckle the front wheels. Von Schweppenburg, already semi-conscious from blood loss, felt the impact as a distant event. The vehicle tilted. Someone, Steinhoff, dragged him from the wreckage. The Thunderbolts made a second pass, their engines roaring. Von Schweppenburg lay in the ditch's mud as bullets cracked overhead. Then silence. The aircraft departed. Hours later, he could not say how many. American voices. Von Schweppenburg opened his eyes to see faces that his entire career had trained him to regard as enemies. Young men in olive drab uniforms with medic armbands, speaking English with accents he could not place. One of them, a corporal with red hair and freckles, looked at von Schweppenburg's bloodied uniform, noted the general's insignia, and turned to shout, "Got a German general here? Head wound. Bad shape." They lifted him onto a stretcher with unexpected gentleness. An American medical officer, a captain, examined von Schweppenburg's head wound with practiced efficiency. "Jesus Christ," the captain muttered. "He's been like this how long?" 36 hours. Skull's fractured in 3 places. Get him to the field hospital now. Priority 1. Von Schweppenburg, hovering at the edge of consciousness, expected to be interrogated, searched, stripped of his decorations. Instead, they carried him to an ambulance, a proper ambulance with suspension that absorbed road shock, with interior lighting and shelves, stocked with medical supplies. The doors closed and the vehicle began moving with speed that would have been suicidal on German-controlled roads. 30 minutes later, the ambulance stopped. The doors opened onto a scene that von Schweppenburg's fever-compromised mind initially rejected as hallucination. What had been a French farmer's field now contained a complete surgical hospital. Large tents arranged in precise rows. Generator lorries providing electricity. Water tanks and sterilization equipment. Supply lorries unloading crates of medications and surgical instruments. Wounded men lay on litters arranged in triage areas. American soldiers, British soldiers, and German prisoners all together, sorted not by nationality, but by medical urgency. They carried von Schweppenburg directly into a surgical tent. The interior was brightly lit, almost painfully so after days in darkened cellars. A surgical team, 3 doctors in clean gowns, 2 nurses, an anesthesiologist, prepared equipment with choreographed efficiency. The chief surgeon, a colonel named Patterson, leant over von Schweppenburg. "General, can you understand me? You have a severe skull fracture with probable intracranial hemorrhage. We're going to operate immediately. You may experience some..." Von Schweppenburg tried to speak, to ask why they were helping him, why there was no delay, no waiting, no triage that would prioritize American wounded over enemy officers. But the anesthesia mask descended over his face, and consciousness dissolved into chemical darkness. A quick note. If you're enjoying this, subscribing really does make a difference. Now back to the story. He woke in increments. First awareness of his own breathing, then the absence of pain. Or rather, pain transformed into a dull ache rather than the previous screaming agony. Then voices speaking English in quiet professional tones. Finally, vision. A hospital tent ceiling. Clean white canvas. Electric lights casting even illumination. A nurse noticed his eyes opening. She was young, perhaps 25, with the accent of the American South. General von Schweppenburg, you're awake, that's good. The surgery went well. Dr. Patterson will be here soon. Do you need water? He nodded, unable to speak. She held a cup to his lips. Cool water, clean water. The first clean water he'd tasted in days. He drank, then found his voice. Why? Why did you operate? I am your enemy. The nurse's expression suggested she'd heard this question before. Sir, you're a wounded human being. That's all the reason we need. Colonel Patterson arrived an hour later. He was 50-ish, grey-haired, with the calm authority of a man who had performed surgery under fire so often that crisis had become routine. He examined von Schweppenburg's head wound, checked his pupil responses, asked him to perform simple cognitive tasks. Count backwards from 100 by sevens. Identify the current date. Remember 3 words and repeat them after 5 minutes. Your skull fracture was severe, Patterson explained. 3 separate fracture lines with bone fragments pressing on the dura mater. We removed the fragments, stopped the bleeding, and repaired what we could. You'll have headaches for months, possibly years, but you'll live. Von Schweppenburg struggled to process this. In his experience, military hospitals were overwhelmed facilities where wounded men waited hours or days for treatment, where morphine was rationed, where triage meant the severely wounded were set aside to die so resources could be devoted to those with better survival odds. Yet here, an enemy general with a complex head injury had been operated on immediately, using what were obviously scarce resources. How is this possible? Von Schweppenburg asked. You're wounded. Surely they must take priority. Patterson sat on the edge of the hospital cot. General, we operate based on medical need, not nationality. That's the Geneva Convention, and it's also practical. We have enough supplies, enough surgeons, enough equipment to treat everyone who needs treatment. Your country's propaganda may have told you otherwise, but we're not barbarians. We're doctors. Over the following days, as von Schweppenburg recovered sufficient strength to observe his surroundings, the full magnitude of Allied material superiority became impossible to ignore. The surgical hospital occupied approximately 5 acres. It contained 12 surgical tents, each capable of performing simultaneous operations. Supply lorries arrived daily with fresh medications, sterile bandages, blood plasma, for transfusions. The hospital's generator provided continuous electricity. Hot food, actual hot meals with meat, vegetables, bread, was served 3 times daily to patients, including prisoners. Von Schweppenburg watched German wounded soldiers react with the same incredulity he had felt. A young Panzer grenadier with both legs shattered by tank treads wept when a nurse brought him morphine without requiring him to beg. An S officer with severe burns refused to believe the blood plasma being transfused into his veins was real until the American doctor showed him the labeled bags. The hospital's American commander, a brigadier general named Morrison, visited von Schweppenburg on his 4th day of recovery. Morrison was cordial but direct. General von Schweppenburg, you're now a prisoner of war. Under the Geneva Convention, you'll be transported to a POW facility in England once you're medically stable. You'll be allowed to write to your family. You'll receive adequate food and medical care. You will not be tortured, starved, or executed. I tell you this because I understand German soldiers have been told to expect different treatment. Von Schweppenburg found himself unable to maintain the ideological certainties that had sustained his entire adult life. He had believed the propaganda about Judeo-Bolshevik hordes, about Anglo-American degenerates who would enslave Europe, about the existential struggle between civilization and barbarism. Yet here the supposed barbarians had saved his life, fed him, treated his wounds with care that exceeded what he'd seen in German military hospitals. As his physical condition improved, von Schweppenburg's capacity for strategic analysis returned. He requested writing materials and began compiling notes on what he'd observed. An American intelligence officer, Major Daniels, visited regularly for debriefing sessions. Daniels was fluent in German and possessed detailed knowledge of Wehrmacht organization. How many aircraft do you have? Von Schweppenburg asked during one session. Daniels smiled. General, you know I can't answer that directly, but consider, on D-Day, the Allied air forces flew 14,000 sorties. 14,000 individual aircraft missions in 24 hours. How many did the Luftwaffe fly? Von Schweppenburg remembered the intelligence reports. 200 sorties, perhaps 300. A ratio of 50 to 1 or worse. Your production capacity, von Schweppenburg said. We were told American industry was exaggerated propaganda. Let me give you some numbers, Daniels replied. In 1943, the United States produced 85,000 aircraft. 85,000. This year we'll exceed 100,000. And that's just aircraft. Tanks, lorries, ships, artillery, similar ratios. General, you were fighting a country that outproduced the entire Axis, combined by a factor of 3 to 1. The outcome was never in doubt. Von Schweppenburg spent long nights considering this arithmetic of annihilation. He thought of his carefully planned counter-offensives, his elegant tactical schemes, his professional pride in operational excellence, all rendered meaningless by industrial capacity. You could not outmaneuver an enemy who could afford to lose 3 tanks for every one you destroyed and still have numerical superiority. You could not win a battle when the enemy controlled the sky so completely that daylight movement became suicide. He thought of the young soldiers under his command, burnt alive in panthers and tigers, told they were fighting for civilization's survival, when in reality they were pawns in an unwinnable war, prosecuted by ideological fanatics. He thought of the lies, the systematic, comprehensive lies that had permeated every level of German society and military culture. 2 weeks after his capture, von Schweppenburg was transferred to a POW facility in southern England. The train journey in a passenger carriage, not a cattle wagon, provided a view of British countryside untouched by war, no bomb craters, no burnt-out vehicles, villages intact, children playing in streets, civilians going about normal lives. The contrast with devastated Normandy was absolute. The POW camp, Camp 318 near Sheffield, was not the hellish facility he'd been conditioned to expect. Barracks were heated, sanitary, equipped with bunks that had mattresses and clean blankets. Prisoners received Red Cross parcels containing chocolate, cigarettes, toiletries. A camp library held thousands of books in multiple languages. Prisoners were permitted to form theatrical groups, orchestras, sports teams. Von Schweppenburg found himself placed with other senior German officers, generals, colonels, staff officers who had commanded divisions and corps. They spent long evenings debating what had gone wrong, constructing elaborate explanations that preserved their professional dignity whilst acknowledging tactical errors. But von Schweppenburg had moved beyond tactical analysis. He had seen the deeper truth. Germany had lost the war not in Normandy, not at Stalingrad, not at El Alamein, but in the conference rooms where Hitler's regime had declared war on nations with 10 times their industrial capacity, while simultaneously alienating potential allies and committing resources to genocidal campaigns that produced no military benefit. He began writing a comprehensive analysis of the Normandy campaign, focusing on the air superiority question. His conclusion was stark. Modern armoured warfare required air cover, and without it, tanks became expensive coffins. The document circulated amongst POWs, then somehow reached British military intelligence, who found it remarkably candid. If you've stayed with us this far, you're exactly the kind of viewer we make these for. Please do subscribe. After the war ended in May 1945, von Schweppenburg remained in British custody until 1947. Upon release, he returned to Germany, or what remained of it. His family estate in Bavaria had been destroyed by a bombing. His wife had died during the war. His son, a U-boat officer, had perished in the Atlantic in 1943. He settled in a small village near Munich and spent his remaining years writing military history. His memoirs, published in 1951, were notable for their unflinching honesty about German tactical failures and strategic delusions. He died in 1974 at the age of 77. Having lived long enough to see Germany rebuilt, democratic but and allied with the same nations he had once fought. But the transformation that defined his life had occurred in that first hour after capture, lying in an American field hospital, receiving medical care that his own propaganda had assured him would never come, experiencing mercy from an enemy he'd been taught to regard as subhuman. In that moment, the ideological architecture of his entire worldview had collapsed as completely as the chateau ceiling that nearly killed him. The sky that had swallowed his army had also forced him to see clearly, perhaps for the first time, the true nature of the war he'd spent 5 years fighting. Not a noble struggle, but a catastrophic mistake prosecuted by a criminal regime that had spent its soldiers' lives like currency, whilst lying to them about everything that mattered.